Welcome back to Natural Beauty Summit's Love and Babies, a Health Journey. I'm Salome Sallehy, your host and founder of Sugar Wax, and this is Angela Chung, co-host and founder of Emdash Beauty. Today's conversation is about preventing allergies. Angela, tell us about our special guest.
So today our guest is Meenal Lele. She is a medical researcher, a mother of two, and the founder of Lil Mixins, and the author of the book, The Baby the Biome, How the Tiny World Inside Your Child Holds a Secret to Their Health. Now, while struggling with her own children's allergies, Meenal discovered the simple and practical steps that parents can take to help foster a healthy and protective microbiome in their baby. She founded Lil Mixins with the mission of ending food allergies.
Ending food allergies. And I think that for some of us who've been around allergies, this seems impossible, but the data is telling us that it's not. So Meenal shares some amazing insights and findings. And if you're have a baby or in pregnancy, this is the perfect time for you to listen to this conversation. So stay tuned for my conversation with Meenal Lele. Welcome to Natural Beauty Summit's Love and Babies, a Health Journey. Today, I am here with Meenal Lele, who is the author of The Baby the Biome. And we're going to be talking about, a lot of things. I have so many questions about the book, but for starters, welcome to the show, Meenal.
Thank you so much for having me. It's cool to be here.
Thank you. So one of the things that I really loved in the book was the analogy of the airport and equating that to, the airport security is your bacteria. And for those of us who are kind of new to this whole arena of bacteria and microbiome that we're covered in inside and outside, can you kind of give us a little bit of an overview of what the microbiome is, and
Sure.
just kind of give us a lay of the land?
Sure. I think where you kind of have to start is really thinking from the perspective that people are not just people. You're both yourself and also a carrier of all these microbes. They live on your skin, inside your gut, in your lungs, in your hair, everywhere, right? And that you are actually an ecosystem. You're a big chunk of it, but the microbes are a big chunk of it. And there's, we'll talk about things like by mass, how much is you versus a microbe, or how much even by genetics. Like if you think about the genes of each of these microbes, 99% of your genes are really in the microbes. But your immune system, to a large extent, exists in these microbes as well. And that's, I think, a part that we didn't really think about. When we think about sickness and being ill, we can't just think about how did my lungs break down or how did my cells break down, right? We also have to think about how did the sickness, how were the microbes involved in the sickness and, counteracting the sickness or dealing with the sickness or causing the sickness, because that's a big part of your immune system. So on the one hand, the microbes, because they're just trying to live themselves, right? They are doing things maybe to keep you alive, maybe to keep you healthy, or just kind of battling each other. And all of this affects how your body functions. And so in that way, the microbes can hijack your immune system. They can be partners with your immune system. And the end point is that they're there and we can't ignore them if we want to think about ourselves and our actual health.
And what was interesting to me is you have all these different teams of microbes, like your security teams, and they all have different functions. And I think a lot of what you're talking about is alluding to, depending on the balance of the ecosystem, like which teams are bigger, you're going to have more or less of their different functions. Now, I'm not explaining it properly, but you refer to the Human Biome Project. Can you elaborate on that? Because that to me, really made it quite finite and a little bit more I can imagine it.
Sure. So people have probably heard of the Human Genome Project, right? Which was when we figured out about DNA, we were like, well, if this is like a map to a person, we got to actually see the map, And so they figured out what are the DNA sequences, the whole DNA sequence across all your chromosomes. So that was the Human Genome Project. And then the Human Microbiome Project was like, okay, we know that there's all this stuff on us, but what is it? And so we're taking samples from different people from different parts of their bodies and really mapping out what are the different, like phylum and genus and species of microbes, and all this stuff matters, right? So, and what are they? Again, because obviously, like your gut is very acidic. It's going to have totally different microbes on it than, under in your hair where it's hot, or on your arm it's going to be different because it's just different, different oxygen, different all this stuff. And so we wanted to know what that was, and so they kind of went down this project to figure out what it was. And just like your genome, you actually get this sort of spread of stuff, and you can see that there's a lot of overlap between people. And a big point there is, just like DNA sequencing technology, it's gotten so much cheaper in just like the last 15 years to figure this stuff out. So now, we can learn a lot more about how much is the same between everybody, how much is different between people, different people from different parts of the world or cultures, or healthy people, not healthy people, things like that.
And I think you mentioned that this project identified like 10,000 different species of microbes on the human body. Like, can you maybe highlight, that's a lot of species. We're not going to get into all of them, but can you maybe touch on a couple of the like really important teams of microbes that we have?
Yeah. Well, so quickly, I want to disambiguate between two things. When that airport analogy and talking about the teams, I was actually talking about, at that point, really your immune system and cells within your own immune system. But this is also, this sort of idea of an ecosystem and teams also applies to, these bacteria. So for example, like we're thinking about a baby, we have certain kinds of bacteria, and their poop in some sense is the oils and the fatty acids that are on our skin, right? Or the bifidobacteria that are in a baby's gut. Those are, and also in an adult, but much more prominent in a baby's gut. Their short chain fatty acids that they create actually create the kind of like mucus lining of the child's gut. We have different funguses that live on us, and we even have different viruses. So we've all been through this pandemic and everything, and your nose is full of viruses. So before like a COVID gets in there, it's not empty space, right? And so interesting, like for some people, those viruses will actually battle off the COVID virus, right? And be like, hey, get out of here. We already set up shop. And so you have, another big piece of that is some of the stuff that's totally safe. Like you can have Staph aureus and it can be fine in your nose. It can get into a cut in your skin and cause really nasty eczema. If it gets into your bloodstream, it can cause death, right? So we have stuff in us that's like completely safe in one place, totally terrible in another place. And so it's just this, and I never actually want to oversimplify it, because I also want to be clear. It's so complex, and because it's not just about the presence or absence of something, it's how they all interact with each other, right? So it's like playing these three dimensions that we've just started to scratch the surface on.
I know, it's so cool. And I'm glad you touched on the COVID thing, because that's another thing that's in your book. And I thought it was really interesting because, for like the last 2-3 years, almost, like we've been on all of these, like on the news, reading studies, all kinds of things about COVID. And I can tell you for sure, never on my radar, and I'm just a regular person, has the gut microbe conversation even come up. And you touch on that in the book. Is there any comment you want to make on that?
So we always want to be cautious. We also always want to caution. So what the studies showed was that we could predict with really high certainty. If you took a sampling of someone's gut microbes, you could predict not only whether they would catch COVID, but whether they were likely to have severe disease and whether they were likely to die. Now, that sounds really scary. And I think one of the reasons we don't talk about it that much is because we don't have the level of understanding to say, so what? Like, it's not as simple as, okay, well, let's give everybody in the country a probiotic and then their risk will go down, right? Because there's also, we want to be careful because there's also always this like circle that happens. So that same microbiome is also highly correlated with heart disease, with diabetes, with, sorry, just like being overweight. And we also know those are all risk factors for having severe COVID.
Comorbidities.
So
Yeah.
like, or sorry, yeah, dying of COVID. So is it that the same bacteria are kind of causing all of these diseases? Is it that the disease caused this bacterial state and now, so when we talk about it, it's really still the disease that's causing the COVID morbidity? Like it's still complex, right? But the right way to think of it is just like it can be a really useful marker of just how sick are you, like how, in a way that you couldn't necessarily look at a person and be like, wow, their risk level is really, really high. um, but this seems to be a really good marker in some ways of maybe an even somewhat invisible sickness level for people.
And I think that's a really empowering point that you make in there, because I think one of the fear factors along the COVID journey has been like, oh my God, we don't know how anyone's going to react. Like
Right.
a perfectly healthy person is super sick and in the hospital, and someone that had all of the risk factors is like perfectly fine.
Yeah.
So I think this actually, for me at least, it was the missing piece that explained that, okay, there's like you said, you can't oversimplify it, but it's
Yeah.
complex, but definitely the gut plays a role.
Yep. And that really plays into, again, not just COVID, but all these other diseases, because we'll look at a kid or someone else and say, hey, in that person's family, there was no risk of that, right? But we weren't considering, we weren't measuring, we weren't considering maybe what was their microbial health. And if we had, we might have been like, yeah, that person, that baby's, got an insanely high risk of this disease, or whatever, right? You can have, like you said, the inverse situation too, where you expect the kid to be really sick, and then you're like, wow, that's weird. They're totally fine.
Yeah, and one of the comments that you made, I mean, this isn't related to my next question, but we're going to get to it, but I just want to bring it up because it's relevant, is one of the comments that you made is that people like we're all born with everything functioning theoretically like kind of perfectly well.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you said, that the immune system doesn't make mistakes off the
Right.
bat.
Right.
I can't remember exactly what the line was, but
Yeah. It's not necessary. It's generally speaking, like mistakes that would be inborn would be genetic mistakes. Like you could have a genetic mistake that just is like, my body is just not going to make this kind of cell, and that's a fundamental mistake of your immune system. That means you're born with a kind of immune disease. But most of the diseases that people are suffering from today, these kind of chronic immune conditions, are not, we're not born with them in that sense. And that's a really important concept. So we talk about our innate immune system. That's sort of like, again, the cells that we're born with, the fact that we have skin. That's what we're set with from the beginning, right? And then the rest of our immune system is adaptive. And a good analogy for that is, again, like you're born with brain tissue and you're born with neurons, and that's like the structure, right? But then what you learn and how those neurons rewire to make you do certain things and behave in certain ways, that's the adaptation. That's how your brain is adapting to your environment, right? And our brains would adapt to very differently in a city environment versus whatever. And your immune system is like that. It's adapting to your environment to deal with these threats. And it's the adaptive part that can make a lot of mistakes. Just like our brain, we could, maybe we hear, or this is a known phenomenon, right? Like children who are born in violence prone areas where they hear gunshots as a child will then have almost like, will have these sort of trigger behaviors when they get older, which have nothing to do with it. And if you think, it's kind of explained by the fact that their brain like is responding to that threat, right?
yeah.
It's a mistake their brain makes. In the same way, your immune system can make these mistakes. And that's really what we're trying to prevent.
Yeah. And before I press you into giving us, kind of tips and lay of the land of how we can optimize our immune system, I just want to talk about you. Like, I really love the way your story unfolded in the book, like, because, here it was a really good balance of like giving me data, but also telling it, like the storytelling through your personal experience with your son. And then sort of towards the end of the book, you go kind of to the beginning. And that's what my question is about is, before we even start worrying about our kids' like future health, we have to conceive. And,
Mhm.
and you talk a little bit about, the woman's microbiome and how that can affect fertility. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. So again, there's a little bit of this classic people will argue about the correlation causation sort of thing, and um, what they have found is sort of again they're taking people who had a lot of trouble conceiving, people who had no trouble conceiving. They're like, okay, oh wow, look, we see that these microbiomes are very different, right? And then if they change the microbiome in the people who were having trouble conceiving, suddenly their odds of conceiving jumps up, right? And so, and very simplistically, it's really about women who inside in the vaginal microbiome have a really high rate of lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is actually, a bacteria that we get from lactose and like cow's milk and stuff like that, right? But that bacteria changes the pH and is one of the key things it does is it changes the pH, but it also, like every bacteria, fights off some stuff. But whether or not that, I always forget it's the zygote, the embryo, whatever, then, the little thing of cells, whether it's able to implant is often kind of dependent on what's the pH. Your body wants to have a successful pregnancy. And now that we are so much more aware of miscarriages, like for example, we're so much more aware that miscarriages are way more common, especially early on when the body detects like a genetic abnormality or this or that. It's just like, nope, this isn't going to work, right? And in that same way, if it tries to implant when the pH is all off or it's sort of the wrong bacteria there, the body's like, nope, this isn't going to work. Let's just, you know, let's let this one go. And so in that way, like supporting a healthy, vaginal microbiome is really supportive of conception and not just conception, but if the baby will be born preterm, same thing. If the microbiome shifts, the body can say like, this isn't working anymore, and so we really want to support that. And the key, people always ask then, well, how do I know? And there are test kits out there and you can use those, but honestly, like key factors are like, do you have a lot of yeast infections? Because the presence of too much yeast is a sign there isn't enough lactobacillus, or do you get a lot of UTIs? Or are you having fertility issues? And in the event of these three things, it's worth looking into. I would say for the average person, it's not something you need to like today stress about.
Yeah, but I thought it was interesting because it's very circular, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, we're talking about like our kids' health like 10, 20 years from now being kind of set
Yeah.
off on the right track at the beginning, which we'll get to. But the journey starts really early on.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. What's amazing me is how much power this microbiome ecosystem has over like our lives and our
Mm-hmm.
bodily functions. And I think like until I read your book, I really had never thought of it that way. I mean, even pregnancy itself is like an entire immunological like journey.
Yeah.
And like there's so many changes that happen in the body. Do you have any tips for moms or moms to be during the gestation period? Like, is there things that they could do to optimize like their microbiome for a healthy pregnancy and ultimately a healthy birth and then ultimately a healthy immune system for the baby?
Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, again, so starting from prior to conception or even afterwards, whatever, you can do these tests. You can check sort of to make sure that the pH is in the right place, and then you're supported by enough bacillus species. They really should come up with like better than those Latin names.
Yeah, like a
Um,
short form.
like friend number one, things I can say. The You can do that. I mean, honestly, the challenge is that I say this a lot, and no one likes this answer, but it's true. Is the things your microbes want, the things that healthy microbes want, are a high fiber diet that is mostly vegetables. that is very little processed food and sugar, that you get exercise and you get sunlight. Like these same things that have supported us for millennia are not, it's not rocket science. Like it's not like you need to take this supplement or take ginkgo biloba or this or that. It's not, it's really comes down to just the basic stuff. Get sleep, eat well, get exercise, get sunlight.
One of the things that surprised me, because I consider myself pretty healthy, like I love fruits and vegetables. And then one number that like kind of surprised me a little bit was like, maybe this was just for the baby, but like it probably applies across the board, but we should be getting like 30 different like
Mm.
types of fruits and
Right,
vegetables throughout a week, right?
right. Yep,
And then when I was taking stock, I was like, oh my gosh, like I pretty much have like the same like 4 or 5 ingredients in my salad all the time. Like
right.
they might fluctuate by one or two. So how do you do that? And does that also, I mean, this is kind of not in your book, but I'm just thinking about it. Is that also affected by like where you are and what's naturally like available to you? Like, thinking about like the 100
Yeah.
mile diet or whatever. Like, I'd love for you to just kind of weigh in on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, like that's a great point, right? I'm trying to think of, like, you think about people that live in Ireland or something, not today, but 1,000 years ago or something, they had access to like 6 foods. And so people are fine on that. I think there's two different ways to think about it. One is that most of your diet should be vegetables, right? Like most of your diet. And that's like Michael Pollan, I think, uses the number like 80%. It's way more than most of us are eating. And the diet diversity is really helpful, mostly because it brings in all these different kinds of nutrients. And again, thinking back to our hunter-gatherer days, if you're a hunter-gatherer, just by definition, you're eating so many different kinds of foods. You're probably not a 30, you're like 100 in a week. You're right that like we're probably not eating that, and that's probably okay in our modern lives. We're also not assaulted in the same way by the environment that they are either, and you're better off eating 6 vegetables and making it a huge part of your diet, right? Than stressing out about trying to get in 30 and then somehow slipping to it only being 15% of your diet, right? So trade-offs about everything. But you're right. I mean, I think that's how that study that they were referencing was just sort of showing again that the richness of the diversity in a person's gut went up, and it was great at about 30 different fruits and vegetables a week. And so that made that kind of a cool goal to hit, because it kind of hit this like really beautifully diverse gut. And there is something to be said, not just for like the presence of these important species, like I talked about Lactobacillus or the bifidobacteria, but the diversity is key, because you don't, much like your adaptive immune system, like you don't know what you're going to encounter, right? And I feel like there's something to the diversity of the species that just kind of gives you the arsenal of things, readiness for whatever viruses and stuff come your way. So
Yeah. And I think like even just, from a practical point of view, it's nice to have like a benchmark or a
yeah,
goal. And you don't have to
yep,
get crazy about it. But just knowing that like made me like last night at my salad, I was like, oh, I have cabbage. I'll just like shave some purple cabbage in
yeah,
my salad. And it's not something I would normally do, but it's just like an easy thing to
yeah,
just add another element to
right.
it.
Yep,
Now,
absolutely.
I know we're going to hit some nerves here, but I really like the way you approach these kind of hot topics in your book. And like birthing, nursing, bathing, allergen exposure, which the whole story of allergen exposure has been like really changing. I would love for you to just kind of touch on those topics,
Sure.
and how they relate to the microbiome and how we can think of it differently.
Okay. So the first, I mean, I can't speak to this enough, is like I really think very differently about the bathing practices, and when I speak about bathing, I'm specifically talking about the use of soaps and chemicals that strip your skin, right? Anything that gets rid of that greasy feeling that makes you feel like, you know, what was it with the toothpaste? They invented this idea of putting mint in it so it sort of felt clean. Now we all associate that, but like the mint is like useless in that, right? It's not actually doing anything. Um, but so especially with babies, like they really just don't need to be washed with soap, like almost ever. And they're just not getting dirty. Like they're not working a manual labor job. They're just not doing anything that requires them to be cleaned with soap. And it's okay to soak them in some, let them like bathe in some water or rest in some water or whatever. But almost all that soap is always stripping their skin. And when the skin is actually our biggest immune organ in many ways, right? Because it is our barrier to the external world. And the baby skin is really sensitive. So when we strip that, it makes it fragile. It's fragile, and it makes it more likely that stuff is going to break through the skin. And we just don't want that, because that's really where the immune system goes into overdrive, and it says like, oh gosh, something's gone wrong here. Like I need to be in high alert, And we actually don't want our immune system in high alert. We want our immune system calm and like composed and ready to act when it needs to, but not overactive. So not overbathing. And that's actually where, for example, breastfeeding comes in. So mom's breast milk is the food, not really for the baby, but it's the food for the bacteria in the baby's gut. And so, so fundamentally in that sense, breastfeeding is better, right? And everyone's going to freak out. So just wait till the end of the sentence.
That's why I preceded this with like, it's a hot topic, guys, but I mean,
the science better than formula, but that doesn't mean formula is poison. Okay. And this is a really important thing for people to understand, is there's no one thing that banishes your kid to a lifetime of illness. It's always a multitude of insults. So all we can do, and the best we can do, is control as many of them as we can. Like it's better to have a vaginal birth because the baby passes through all of that bacteria, but it's not better for the baby to have a vaginal birth if that's going to hurt the baby and or the mother, right? So we want to do the thing that's an optimal choice. So we have the C-section when it's the right thing to do. I talk about moms trying to prevent group B strep, because if you have it, they'll give you a course of intravenous antibiotics in the hospital. And it's great for baby to not have group B strep. It's also really great for them to not have antibiotics, right? Yeah. So we want to, again, choose the most optimal path. So again, like if the baby gets a skin infection or does get a cut or does something, that doesn't mean don't wash that cut. It means like in a normal situation, there's no reason to do that. And maybe if you end up with formula, we breastfeed. But I actually had a doctor reach out to me the other day. She was now, going through this with her little one herself. And she's like, well, the baby's really distressed and I can't figure out what's going on. And I'm reading your book. And I said, if you think it's the food, then switch the baby to hypoallergenic formula for a little while and see if that helps. And if it does, then you're pretty sure it's the food. And if it doesn't help, then you're pretty sure it's not the food, right? And she was like, oh, but isn't formula like poison? And I was like, as a doctor of all people, you should know that even if you think breastfeeding is better, breastfeeding plus constant distress is definitely worse than formula, right? So we're all talking trade-offs. So we do, healthy skincare. And then as soon as the baby's ready for food, we want to get all, again, this is, I think, largely part of diet diversity, is as many of these foods in there. We want regular exposure to all the things the baby might otherwise confuse as an allergen. So we want a lot of exposure to peanuts, to eggs, to, all the different nuts, sesame, soy, all this stuff. And it can train the baby's body to tolerate those foods. So if we do those things, if we're really, if we try our best to protect baby skin, to help them develop a healthy gut from the beginning. And then the last big thing, which is, again, hard to control, is what air is the baby breathing? So, there was the big gas stove debate, but whether you use a gas stove or you use induction stove, if your house is all smoky from the cooking, that's not good for baby. Like the baby shouldn't be in front of campfires. The baby shouldn't be around anyone who's smoking. The baby shouldn't be breathing car exhaust. They can avoid it, right? We try and reduce that as much as possible. Again, everyone's in a different situation and you can't fix everything, but you fix what you can.
Yeah. And one of the things, like with the bathing thing that, kind of surprised me, but like being in the skincare business myself, like when I do the talks, like I'm always telling people, like, you want to preserve the pH balance of your skin, especially when you're doing things that are, exfoliating or whatever,
Hmm.
because it does make that skin barrier a little bit more vulnerable. And when I read that in your book about the baby, I'm like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense, because the baby's skin is just, like out in the world and air
Hmm.
for like the first time. And it's a critical point where they're developing their like skin microbiome,
Hmm.
which is going to affect them throughout their whole life, like whether, it's like acne or,
Yep.
whatever it might be. Like it really affects them long term. And I was like, we have such a bathing culture. And I did this
Yeah.
myself. I'm totally guilty of it. And I'm like, oh my gosh. But yeah, you're right. Like, it's not just that they're not sweaty and they're not stinky, but it's also that they need, what I loved was like how you said that like the microbiome is like needs to be protected and helped and supported. And I don't think typically we think of,
Right.
our skin in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. So just as much as we think about, well, does the baby feel sweaty, which is a thing that maybe you need to worry about, but you also need to think about what behaviors are supporting a healthy microbiome. Again, in the lungs, in the on the skin, and in the gut. So it has to be, and I think that's why the book is called The Baby and the Biome, because it's about how do you care for your baby, but also how do you care for their microbiome.
Yeah. Um, Now we're like the connection between gut health and immunity has like basically been established.
Yeah.
And the connection between, immunity and the gut has been is, or did I just say that? What I'm trying to get to is the connection between like the gut immunity and allergens. Cause I kind of think of these things as like like separate, but in your
Hmm.
book you really like connect these dots. And one of the things that I found staggering was like these days we're expecting children, 40 to 50% of children, to develop autoimmune disorders. So you have
To
like,
be clear, not just autoimmune and immune conditions. So it could be allergic immune diseases or autoimmune diseases.
okay,
Like you
allergic
add that all
immune,
together. Yeah.
right? And that's another thing, like I never really put like autoimmune
Hmm.
and allergic immune together, but it's all immune based, immune,
Yeah.
like your immune system based. So can you kind of connect the dots for us there? Because it's
Sure,
all
sure.
very related.
It is, and it gets confusing, because okay, so you have your immune system, right? That's the biggest umbrella, and then you have your autoimmune conditions, and then you have your allergic immune conditions. And the difference is that typically, the allergic immune conditions, the flares as we think about them, are triggered by something external to the person, like pollens or foods or touching latex or something, right? So it's an external trigger. In the autoimmune conditions are the immune system not trying to fight an external thing, but incidentally fighting a cell in your body, right? So they get confused, and your immune system gets confused, and it starts fighting the cells of the pancreas, or it starts fighting the cells of the intestinal lining. And now where it gets hazy is like you get an autoimmune condition like celiac disease that only flares after the person has eaten wheat. But it's weird because the person eats wheat, that causes the release of certain chemicals, and some cells inside the gut. I'm kind of hand waving here, but just go with it. Is and then the immune system starts attacking the intestine because of that process. And so, but it's not really attacking the wheat; it's attacking your body after it has tried to eat the wheat, but then that process can go on for a really long time. And so that's sort of how they're all related. And in the end, the more important thing to think about, I suppose, is that these autoimmune conditions are largely just like allergies. They're mistakes, right? Your body shouldn't be attacking itself. That's not what it's supposed to be doing. So it's a mistake the body is making just as much, or the immune system is making just as much as an allergic disease. And arguably, it's a lot worse, right? Because if your body just shuts down and you develop type 1 diabetes, that's actually obviously a much more difficult disease to deal with than, I think, food allergy, um, or so on and so forth, right? And so, yeah, so they're all related in that way. it's also related because the same sorts of environmental insults, like air pollution is a really good example. As air pollution gets in the lungs, for some people, that those small tiny particles, as they lodge into the cells, will cause the body to basically, the next thing that comes in, like a pollen, the body will freak out and say, like, wow, that pollen's really terrible, so now I'm going to have asthma and I'm going to react anytime I see that thing. Or it could go the other way. That same thing lodges in the, into the cells and the body. And when the body is trying to deal with it, your immune system freaks out and says, hey, not only is this thing there, these new cells showed up, and now I'm going to attack those, but they're your own cells. And so the exact same cause can actually go in these two different directions, if you will, of autoimmune disease and allergic disease. And I'm sorry if I'm going like way too deep for this.
No, deep is good. We like deep because we like to understand. And for me, like I kind of thought about like immunity and allergens as like completely like different silos. So
Right.
it's interesting to understand that, like, and when I thought about it, and I'm not like an expert, clearly, but when I thought about it, I'm like, okay, it makes sense when you have like an ecosystem or a society, right? If you have too much like police or too much security, they're gonna make mistakes, right? Because they're like, hypersensitive to or more reactive. So just this idea, and even though it sounds complex, guys, I actually think the complexity simplified it for me, because I think a lot of these things are like really natural, but we've kind of disconnected from like just listening to our own bodies.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm having, like, if I experience like chronic yeast infections, there's a problem. You know what I mean? But we're like going to the doctor or whatever, which we should, obviously. But then we're trying to get really simple answers. It's like, here's a pill, fix it.
Right.
But whereas really everything kind of works together, and it's reflected in our environment, like, the world that we live in, our environment works together, all the things. And then our bodies are very similar in that way. So for me, it was more like, do the things that you're supposed to do that feel natural. And if something feels off, then maybe you need to kind of like reevaluate what you're putting into your body, what you're putting on your skin, which is really like, the whole theme of Natural Beauty Summit has been what we put in and on our bodies and how that affects us.
It's everything.
You talk about, like just kind of going back to like nursing. I mean, it's a part of it, but you talk about the development of like, I think, is it like 60 or 70% of the immune system sort of happens within the first couple of months of life.
Yeah, so we usually think of like 80, much again, same like your brain. 80% of your brain development happens in the first 3 years, right? And just like that, 80% of your immune system decisions, this sort of, again, this adaptive part of it is happening in your first 3 years of your life. And you've created some cells and you've done all this stuff that, but it's pretty early on. And there's a lot of companies and there's a lot of focus from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Was just reading somewhere else that they talk about the first 1,000 days a lot. This whole idea, your first 3 years.
In your book was actually the first time I had heard it. It was your book.
Okay.
But yes.
I think more people are catching on though. I was recently talking to one of the leads at Johnson and Johnson's like consumer products thing, and he was like, "That's our focus, 100%, 1,000 days. Like we're thinking about our whole suite of products in terms of like." How are we supporting a baby in their first 1,000 days, right? So it's definitely a concept that's catching on.
Oh, thank goodness. Like as a mom who, kind of had to learn the hard way, that kind of, I think that your experience with Leo is what really catapulted you into this research and ultimately the book. And I have to say, I really appreciate like how you approach it. It's like, you've written this book so that it's kind of got that village vibe where like I've gone through this and I've learned, and I don't want you to learn the hard way. So read the book. And
That's the 100% the engineer in me, right? Like I can't, my brain like explodes at the idea of doing the same thing twice. You know, like anytime I have to do any routine thing, I like set up an automated way to do it again. And so the idea that like I would go through all this trouble and then not tell my sister, not tell you, it's just like, how insane is that?
yeah. And I really like that approach. And I think it was really honest. And that's what like made me really not want to put the book down, because I was like, oh my God, this is great information. But like also coming from the perspective of like, I've done the research, learn from it. And I think allergens and allergies is something that we deal with a lot. And it does kind of vary geographically, I would say. We don't need to get into that. But like, what advice do
Mhm.
you have for moms who are, um, whether they're like pregnant and their like niece or nephew has like crazy allergies and they're like, oh my God, I don't want that. How do I
Yeah.
fix that? Or someone who has a child. I know that the earlier you deal with it, the more effective it is.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
a lot of people, like one of my best friends, your namesake, actually, her son has like so many allergies,
Yeah.
and he's now 10.
No, we're
Um,
in the same boat. Yeah. So my son's almost 9, the same one who has like the 10 different allergies and stuff. Yeah.
yeah.
Give her my number.
Yeah. So what advice do you have for moms that are either like anticipating they have to deal with allergies or are dealing with allergies or are, encountering new allergies? Like what's some good advice you have for them?
Yeah. So it's really in 3 parts to this, right? It's number one, prevention is key. So it's so much simpler, and the things you need to do to prevent allergies are just so relatively mindless and simple relative to what you'd have to deal with later. So just do them. Take care of the skin. Use the probiotics if you want to, like do the early allergen introduction, clean air, right? That's going to be like the beast of prevention. Then, if you're dealing with the allergies, I think that, and whether this is new or it's been going on for a long time, I think the key there is to think about the fact that, again, allergies mean that your body is reacting to something. So there is a thing, it's like you have a headache and someone's like, oh, hey, it's because that guy's been hitting you in the head with a tennis racket. And you're like, oh, let me get rid of this tennis racket. Then your headache goes away. And it's just like that, right? That was a weird analogy, but it is like that. There's sometimes this just like invisible thing. And so if you want to deal with it, you have to figure out what's the thing. And there's 2 pieces to it. The first is you have to get the immune system to calm down. And it's never going to calm down as long as it's upset about being hit constantly, right? So you have to find the things that are causing the flares and get rid of them. Then after that, once you can get the immune system to pause, it can actually start to heal. But that's when you move over to the phase of, if you're having a lot of gut issues, like can I work with a naturopathic physician, or can I eat better? And honestly, for a lot of people, like 3 years of eating really, really, really cleanly will heal up your gut. 3 to 5 years. It's I mean, it's a long time, but it's also like, it's 3 years out of your whole life. Or whether it's a skin thing, or changing the air, like if you can give your body a chance to heal. And again, it's very much, if you think about, like if you had a scar and it was, or like like a cut and it was like bleeding, but you're constantly like pulling at the scab, like it's never gonna, the skin is never gonna heal, right? Like you have to first stop whatever is scraping it
Yeah.
and then give it a chance to heal. And then once it heals, it can actually go back to a completely normal state. Right. And so that's the promise. And I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it or say it like it's just like, I think I talk about in the book, like the years it took to sort of figure out what were the different triggers. But we finally got to that place where, for the most part, the immune system is like calm. And now we're in the very, very long phase of like seeing, since it's not constantly flaring, can we actually make things better? And I will say, like, it's better. Like his skin was like paper, sandpapery when he was little. And it's like, now I tuck him into bed and I'm like, oh, how luscious, and so that you can see this level of it's actually getting better. It's healing itself as it finally has the chance.
One of the things that you said in the book was, like in hindsight, at the very first signs of eczema,
Yeah.
seeing eczema on Leo's skin, I should have, and I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly, but correct me if I'm wrong. I should have exposed him to all the allergens.
Yes, that's correct.
So that's a little bit different than what you said now. And I think because the context is different, can you kind of explain that a little bit?
Sure. So the allergens were not causing his eczema, right? His eczema was being caused by other things. But weirdly, still, the data shows that at that young age, you know, eczema is a sign that the immune system is already in kind of like a hypervigilance state. But weirdly, you have this, the immune system kind of gives you this window in its training period, you know, and again, I use this analogy a lot, but it makes a lot of sense to people, which is like a baby of a certain age is listening for the sounds of their language. Like, how do I know what's people talking to me versus car sirens versus dogs barking versus whatever, right? And the brain gives you this window to like be like, you know, listen to these vowel sounds, listen to this, and kind of ignore the other stuff, right? And then the baby learns their language. And just like that, your immune system actually gives you this window, typically between about 5 months to 10 months old, to teach it what are the foods you plan to eat for the rest of your life. And it's very accepting and it builds tolerance. It's biased towards saying, okay, keep getting fed this stuff, so I'm going to try and tolerate it instead of reacting to it. And why we say that is because the kids with eczema, what that's saying is that their immune systems are prone to making mistakes because their immune systems are kind of like a little bit, you know, cockeyed right now. So in fact, for them, more than any other kid, almost, you want to be aggressive about being like, here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to do. You know, stay cool when you see this. Stay cool when you see this. And in the same way, like imagine a kid who had hearing trouble. That might be a kid who, instead of just letting them hear language, you might sit in front of their face and say like, we say our vowel, you know, like you would go through the extra effort of trying to teach them because they have this deficit.
And thank you for sharing that. I think that, you know, like while a lot of the data and the research and the science is very new, the wisdom behind some of these things aren't. Like one of the examples that I shared with you is in my culture, I'm Iranian. In my culture, on the 7th day after birth, we have like a nut party, which is like such a weird thing. Like, and this has gone back like hundreds, maybe thousands of years, but like definitely hundreds. It's a very old school thing to do, is like the family gathers round and, you know, everyone's cracking nuts and eating nuts and fruit. And now I'm like, oh, that's why. Like all the things that, you know, older cultures have. Or like one of the things that you talk about is bathing with the coconut oil and the chickpea flour. Oh my gosh. Like, so, I mean, I guess like, what is your perspective on like, why is all this older wisdom there? And then this new science is now kind of coming to light. Like, is there a convergence that's happening or gonna happen, or should we be paying attention to, you know, ancient rituals? Like, what are your thoughts?
It's hard to say, right? Because for every great example of like, we'll give the babies, you know, same thing in India, they make this like paste out of almonds and like 5 other things that I always forget. And you like feed it to the baby in, you know, little bits like from the beginning, right? So for every really smart idea people had basically by accident, let's be honest, they had a ton of terrible ideas by accident too, right? And a lot of terrible traditions also have continued, right? So, I mean, we don't need to get into all the like, you know, when girls get on their period or something, they need to get isolated to a different part of the house. Like there's no reason for that, right? So my point is just that ancient wisdom can be a little bit hit or miss. And it's not clear which ones are the hits and which ones are the misses. And so today, I mean, despite this data being new, it's really, really good data, right? They took thousands of babies and did a very clean clinical study, and they studied it and they found out it was true. And so, you know, it kind of comes back to like, it's just hard to say, right? Like you know, when it comes to child rearing, like almost every culture, beating your kids is actually a big part of how you teach them, right? And that's like questionable now. Like we've done the studies and we're like, maybe not so much, right? So I don't know. It's hard to say, right? Like, because you definitely kick yourself when you see the stuff that you let go by accident, like this, you know, like the eating the nuts and stuff. But there's lots of stuff we should definitely let go also. So,
okay, that's fair. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. To our viewers and listeners, The Baby and the Biome by Meenal Lele. Great book. I mean, my kids are not babies, but like I kind of wish that this book was happening around the time that I was pregnant. I definitely would have read it. So if you're thinking of conceiving or you're already pregnant, I think it's such a great book. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your wisdom and your findings with us. It's definitely making the outlook on allergies and autoimmune and all immune related things,
Hopefully a little brighter.
a little brighter. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having me. It was cool talking with you.
Likewise. Take care. And guys, as always, in the email, you'll have all of Meenal's links and where you can find her and where you can get the book. Thanks for joining. Bye.